thank you very much indeed. I just want to focus on financial services, if that's all right, and really get to the bottom of how important Russian firms are to our financial services industry. We've discussed today that there's been a combination of both official sanctions by governments on companies, but also voluntary sanctions. And if you just take two examples, Gazprom was sanctioned by the United States, and their share price went down 85%, and it accounts for 22% of the MSCI EM index. BP sold its 19% share in Rosneft and saw its share price go down 5%, and that equates to about 3.5% of the FTSE 100. So these are companies that are held by savers and investors in this country and around the world. And I saw one report that international investors account for about 170 billion in Russian assets. So from your perspective, Neil, what has been the impact on savers and investors and pension funds in particular of these sanctions and these voluntary sanctions that we've seen in particular?
Yes, I think it's difficult to kind of put a precise number on this, but I think that they're in essence are the kind of channels through which you'd expect to see the impact. There's the impact on share prices and the profits of companies and dividends they pay out, and the extent to which that flows to savers and pension funds. I think there's also a case that this is going to push up inflation. And because I suspect that nominal interest rates will not rise by as much as inflation will rise as a result, real interest rates are going to fall further, and so returns may fall further as a result as well. But this is really just one manifestation of a much broader problem, which is that if we're a net energy importer, if the price of energy goes up, then someone bears the cost. That can either be the government, it could be companies, it could be households. Within households who are savers, so it can affect savers as well as through the kind of inflation channel and real income channel. So it's just one way in which the cost of this is going to be felt in the real economy.
And Justin, do you have a perspective? I know a lot of fund managers have sector limits and risk exposure limits in terms of their portfolios from a compliance standpoint. Have you heard from the fund management industry and others as to how this is impacting their investors and their clients?
So I think at the stage we're currently at the moment is because of the speed. Normally what we would see in these sanction scenarios is there's a gradual escalation and people have time to prepare. And it has just come on at such a speed that I think everybody is they're still the rabbits in headlights. We are seeing a lot of divestment, so people trying to offload their Russian exposure. So this is probably where we're seeing most of the energy at the moment. In terms of the longer term elements that Neil's just spoken about, we haven't even got to that, to be honest, if I'm totally honest.
Okay, thank you. Tom, we had a discussion earlier about who's winning the race from a country perspective as to how many people have been sanctioned or companies have been sanctioned. You made the point that we shouldn't be looking at that, we should be looking at the effect. But can I ask you about the coordination internationally? Do you feel that there's been sufficient coordination between the US, UK and European Union in particular as we implement these sanctions?
Yeah, there has clearly been very, very intense coordination, as you would expect, and I would kind of congratulate those involved in the coordination of ideas, if you like. So I would have no beef with that. I think we then get on to execution, having coordinated, and that's perhaps something that we ought to start to look at, because at the moment, I think we all agree there's quite a lot of self-sanctioning. I think I like that phrase that Neil used. People are deciding not to trade with Russia, not because they're not allowed to, but because they're just not quite sure what on earth to do right now. There will come a point where that sort of stasis in the system will begin to melt, and we need to make sure that people understand what is allowed and what is not allowed very clearly at that point.
You, in response to one of the questions, you talked specifically about the wind-down period, I think, for banks, or it might be you, Justin, apologies. My understanding in the US, the licensing has been granted quicker or at the same time as sanctions have been announced. The UK has not, and this is causing a lot of problems for our derivatives traders. Can you just expand a bit more for the committee on what that means?
So Yes, a little bit more, probably not as much as I would like to be able to. But in terms of when we've seen the US come forwards with their asset freezes, for example, they have come out at the same time with the general licenses, so you have 30 days or whatever to withdraw and close out your positions. In the UK, there was a bit of a delay. There was also quite a bit of ambiguity around what was permissible or not. So what we've seen, and Tom will actually be able to add on a lot of more information given his background, but what we've seen is a lot of financial institutions and others trying to close out their positions, trying to offload their exposure. So within that, they've actually, and this is an element as well which picks up on the financing side, we've talked about BP and others sort of withdrawing, but what people are having to do when they close out, they're having to negotiate what the price is they're closing out, how do they close that out. And what we saw in 2014 actually is we saw some, and in the context of Venezuela, we've seen some people divesting their exposure and closing out and getting rid of their exposure at actually quite preferential rates because they just wanted to withdraw. So that actually has benefited in previously from the 2014 scenario, that actually benefited Russia in some scenarios. But now what we're really seeing is just the lack of trying to understand how to close out, because this is really important and it's about closing out in a way which ensures that financial stability. And it's not about giving money back to the sanctioned entity. You're not making funds available to the sanctioned entity, but you have billions in flight. I mean, these financial institutions are literally WhatsApping each other about transactions which are billions upon billions going, do we think this is captured? Can we close this out? We want to actually get rid of it, or we want to freeze it, or we want to do something else with it. And actually what they're trying to understand, what is their legal basis for doing that, and if they are trying to actually withdraw and reduce their exposure, how do they manage that in a way for their own financial stability? But Tom, would you like to...
We've talked about the ambiguity. I just want to talk about the timing.
So the timing is we have seen specific scenarios where the wind down license period doesn't actually reflect the required amount of time to wind down. So there's some scenarios there where there has been requests to extend wind down provisions by a number of days just because of the mechanism for how that works. We've also seen inconsistent approaches from allies on what type of timeline and how broad the timeline is for winding down. So one of the messages that we've been really trying to stress to like-minded partners imposing sanctions is that they ensure that the licenses which they put in place, and remember these licenses are there either to protect critical business or to ensure financial stability, they're actually consistent, because the worst case scenario is when you have the US saying one thing and the UK and the EU saying another thing. So, and I think it's partly to do with just the speed sanctions are being agreed. Policymakers are just desperate, because the situation obviously in Ukraine is desperate and speed is of the essence. So people have been making these decisions very quickly, but not necessarily working through what needs to be done from the back office point of view to ensure that's all can be implemented efficiently.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I just want to ask one more question of you, Neil. In 1998, Russia defaulted on its debt, partly to pay for the war in Chechnya. How are you looking at that for this scenario? Do you think Russia will default on its debt?
Well, several things to say, but I'm conscious of time. Russia's government balance sheet is order of magnitude much stronger now. So there's much less debt in the system. It's running budget surpluses, partly because of the Fortress Russia point that we've talked about. So I think the risk of an enforced default because they simply can't afford to pay is much lower. There's a question about whether there's a selective default out of choice, and indeed we started to see some signs that might emerge on local law, local currency bonds to foreign investors. I suspect we will see non-payments of coupons in that area. It's a relatively small part of global financial systems. I don't think it would have a big major financial contagion. Obviously in 1998 there was contagion. LTCM, the big hedge fund in the US, collapsed partly as a result of taking big bets on Russian debt. There's less of a kind of big contagion risk this time around, but there's always potential for unanticipated consequences.
Credit rating agencies are already reduced them to junk, I think.
They've
as
already
well.
been reduced to junk.
So a lot of the firms will have sold out, pretty much. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. And now